Okay, good morning everybody. My name is Ian Cowx from the Hull International Fisheries Institute, and I'm starting this process of these lectures by looking at one specific area which we've tended to neglect quite a lot, and I want to show you sort of the processes where we actually sought to adopt planning within the restoration project framework. What I want to do today is actually sort of look at three main areas. The first one here is actually looking at a determination of restoration success, which is something, as I'll show you, it has been neglected. Particularly I want to talk about benchmarking and endpoints, so setting reference conditions and actually looking at targets and what we should be targeting for. I want to look at a project planning approach which is quite complex, but we're tending to simplify for the benefits of you as we go through. I want to have a look at improving outcomes of restoration success by looking at synergies with other sectors. Most of the time we just deal with restoration in terms of a project. We go and do something, but we don't actually look at the implications it could have with other sectors or how other sectors could influence the outcomes of the project. So just look at that quickly. And then I just want to look at, take that forward in terms of a simplification of a project planning process, which is linked with the Reform Wiki, which will provide you with the outcomes of many of the exercises that are taking place globally. Well, certainly within Europe, but globally as well. Why do we restore rivers? We restore them for all sorts of reasons, and we do all sorts of measures, from very, very simple basic measures through to some fairly complex ones. And these are the sorts of things that you may have seen in terms of bank stabilization, where you've actually got erosion of the bank and you're trying to stabilize it, and you can put in some structures, preferably using natural products rather than concrete, to stabilize the bank to stop erosion taking place. We might want to increase habitat diversity through things like small log weirs, where you're creating a pool upstream and some flow conditions or a scouring pool below. Situations like this one in an urban area, this is in Sheffield in the UK, where placing rocks because the whole of the channel has been simplified and we want to try and increase the habitat diversity. And then you go to these very complicated situations such as we've got here, recollecting the floodplain. This is the Rival here in the Netherlands, and you've got reconnection of the side water channels and backwater channels while still maintaining the navigation processes. We do a lot of this type of stuff in restoration. In fact, a lot of emphasis has always been on reconnecting the river so that fish can move up and downstream. And so you see huge different types of fish passages from very, very simple Larinier systems or pool traverse systems like this, through to very complex ones, nature-like bypass systems, which allow the fish to go up through a stream, regenerate a stream to bypass an obstacle. These are very good because actually fish even breed in them, as we found from what we've done in the past. If you have a look at the scale of what's going on in terms of restoration activities and go through the river basin management plans, the existing river basin management plans, there's a whole diversity of restoration activities to do with hydromorphological processes that take place. These here can be broken down into a whole series of areas such as ecological flows, natural restoration measures to hold water. So this is to prevent flooding. We've got things like sediment management strategies, naturalization, so renature the system, and coming down here to mitigate the impacts of barriers. And if you actually go through the river basin management plans, the proportion of these plans that hold these different activities, as you can see, is up to about 70%. So there's a lot of the plans for different river systems looking at reconnecting the migration routes of fish. There's an awful lot of doing restoration of bank structures and rebuilding habitats for breeding of fish and breeding of other aquatic animals. And then you've got quite a lot of things of looking at managing flows, such as ecological flow requirements, so the water is sufficient for the animals and plants and things that actually live there. So there's an awful lot of activities take place, but which ones do you choose? When you go to a river system that's been degraded in some way, which measure do you choose? Which activity do you choose? Which one's going to be the most successful? And if you have a look at what's taken place globally and also within the European Commission. We did a review of the various European projects that were taking place and a review of all the LIFE projects that we could find that were dealing with improvements in aquatic biodiversity. And if you have a look at those, in conjunction with about 37,000 North American projects were looked at by Margaret Palmer, you can actually see that a huge number of them actually didn't have any endpoint. They didn't have any definition of what they were trying to achieve, which is pretty bizarre considering the investment that goes into restoration projects. You think of the cost of them. So they didn't actually define what they wanted to get out of it. And that's a huge proportion. I'll show you a bit more on this in a second. Many of the outcomes that we actually looked at in relation to the European projects were related to Water Framework Directive. And basically the outcome they were defining is to achieve good ecological status, to achieve good ecological potential. But what is that? These are very big areas of change that you're trying to achieve. And quite honestly, if you put some activities in, you may be improving the quality slightly, but you're probably not improving the ecological status. You may be at moderate, but moderate is such a big boundary that to move within it, you could easily move within it and actually not see any potential change. These are very, very open definitions of success where we need to be a bit more specific and actually have more quantitative targets. And as I say, in relation to this, the targets are very, very rarely quantitative. A lot of this is because it's incredibly difficult to do monitoring. If you want to monitor big rivers like that photograph I showed earlier of the River Vaal, it's a huge river system. How do you monitor what the success is in quantitative terms? It looks good, and it probably is good, but how do you actually measure those sorts of outcomes? So what we're missing quite often is some measures or targets against which we can measure success of the activity that's taking place. If you go back, and just to show you the problems that we've got here, if you actually go back and look at the success rates of the European projects that we evaluated, here you can see the breakdown of the success in terms of biological outcomes, in terms of morphological outcomes, and in terms of physiological chemical outcomes. And if you have a look, the purple line, the bottom line here, the big numbers, basically said there's no information. So the majority of those projects had no measures of outcomes and outcome success. If you have a look at the amount of success, it's a small number, this top bar in each of these. Very small proportion of these projects have got measures of success to say they've actually achieved some activity and been successful. The bizarre one is the number of failures. Now, I've been involved in many, many projects, and I don't believe they're all successful. But if you actually look at the proportion here, 7 biological failures, 2 morphological failures, and 2 physicochemical failures. If you believe that, good luck, because I don't believe it. And it's because we don't measure it or we don't report it, which is probably what's going on. People don't like to report failures, so they tend to leave it out. It's very important that we actually report failures because people can learn from those failures. So we really need to invest time in both measuring what's going on and actually indicating where things have gone wrong. The reasons for it are multifold because of really we don't adopt any systematic approach to planning of restoration projects. We tend to go and do them. In many cases, particularly in small scale projects, there tend to be money that's available at the end of a year or become available a small period of time. So you literally go in and do it. You've probably got something you'd like to do and you just literally go and do it as quickly as possible. So we don't put in the opportunities to measure these activities. We don't often set objectives, mainly because money comes in a fragmented way. So we don't set really solid objectives of what those activities are going to be, or we do them on a small scale and we don't link it up in the catchment level. And that's a problem. We tend to look at individual little projects and we don't have it on a broad-based catchment scale, which is where we need to operate in river restoration. Many of them fall short of the objectives, as I've shown you, but the reality is actually the objectives are not set. So we have a great difficulty measuring what that success will be. And if we're going to improve our outcomes of restoration measures and all the activities that take place, all the millions of euros that are spent, we're going to have to find a way of actually measuring this. So we probably need, or we do need, from my perspective, we certainly need management tools based on the river basin scale to actually look at the success of projects. And what I want to do is show you some of this as we're going on. Within the Reform project, what we've developed is a catchment scale planning approach. Now, this looks extremely complex, and I'm going to break it down into smaller parts for you and then break it down further. But this is actually a management tool called the project cycle. And what we've done is we've integrated it in the overall planning process. And the project cycle actually is broken down into 3 or 4 main components. And they're written here. You identify your project, you formulate your project, you then do it, and then you monitor it. The reality is that this part, the formulation, often doesn't take place. The identification takes place, but the formulation doesn't take place. Project implementation always takes place, but rarely do we monitor what's gone on. In this process, at each stage, here in the early phases of a project, you should be identifying what the project will be in relation to the needs of your country, in the needs of your international obligations, such as the Water Framework Directive, or in terms of what that river basin needs to get better. So you're defining objectives both at a national level, at a local level, and regional or international level. Define what they are. Identify what they are and target those things, because that's what you're setting your restoration for. That's what you want to try and achieve. So you want something here that is a broad-based approach that can achieve something. From that, what we need to do is actually identify what the main problems are within your water body. What are the big pressures acting on your water body? What's constraining, what's degrading your river system? And critically, we need to look at the issues that are taking place, so all the pressures and what the effects of those pressures are on that river system. We can then compare the, actually I've missed a point out here. We should actually look at what the status of your water body is, what's its condition, what's its overall condition in terms of how it's been degraded and what the cause of those degradations are. We can then compare the status of the water body against what you want to try and achieve. So if the water body's here, the status of it's here, and your objectives are here, what you've got to do is actually find the measures or the activities that will actually bring you up towards where your target is going to be. And this is the process that people often forget to do. They forget to set the objectives and look at the status and see how you're going to move between one and the other. This is a key element that's fundamentally missed in quite a lot of project planning. That will then allow you to look at the different measures that you can operate and move forward and put into the project. And here we have identification of the measures that will take place that will actually achieve those objectives for you, to move you from the basic status you're on now to where you want to go. So identifying restoration measures that are appropriate. Within this part, you've also got to start to look at the cost. An element that people tend to forget, that doing restoration measures and doing restoration actually is a very expensive activity, costing millions and millions of euros. So you've actually got to look at what's feasible within the economic framework that you're living within. So how much money have you got available? Sometimes you can do a massive, massive project and you can achieve fantastic outcomes, but you may not have that type of money available to you. So you've got to look at what's available to you and what you can best achieve. So you've got to put some cost benefit analysis in at this point. As I'll show you later, that's actually not as easy as it sounds, because those sorts of information are not necessarily available. You can then implement the project. You've actually designed the project, you can implement it, and go forward and actually evaluate it. How you evaluate it, the monitoring and evaluations, I'm not going to address here, but we certainly need tools to assess the outcomes of restoration measures, to look at the change and to see if the change has been what we're targeting. Within this whole exercise, there are a whole series of other management tools that are available to you, and I'll come back to some of these in a minute. But you've got this process, what's called the PDCA, the plan it, do it, check it, and then act. And this actually allows you to be adaptive. So if you're not quite getting what you want, you can adapt and change the way your action takes place. Don't always do it and then walk away. You really need to be adaptive, and you may have to put in the other appropriate measures. There's also a very good tool called DIPSIA, Drivers, Pressure States, Impact and Response tool, which, excuse me, which allows you to look at what is driving the activity on the river system, such as hydropower. Why do you want it? We need it because we need power. But what's the pressure that causes it? It's changing flows, barriers to migration. And the impacts of that will be on things like fish populations will be compromised. And then we have to respond to that. So how can we respond to those sorts of things? I'll come back to that a little bit more. And when you're setting your objectives, always set realistic objectives. And there's a nice little tool called SMART objectives. So make sure that the objectives are very specific. You know what you're trying to do. Don't just have a general one, improve Water Framework Directive, good ecological status, because what does that mean? Is it measurable? So the monitoring allows you to actually look at that change, so make it quantitative. Is it achievable, attainable? And my response to that is quite often they're unrealistic. So let's be realistic about what you can achieve rather than having these superficial targets which potentially we won't get to. Is it relevant? Is it relevant for social and economic reasons? So you really want to know whether you've got relevance of your project. Do people want it? Sometimes they may not want it, and so you have compromises and constraints. And always look at time bound. Restoration activities take place over long time periods, and people forget that. So you've got to build in a time frame in what you're trying to achieve. Many managers come along and they say, right, we want a response and we want our river to be in good ecological status or achieve improvements almost by tomorrow. And I think we all recognise that it can often take 5 or 10 year time frames to actually get the benefits or achieve the benefits. The thing about this complex activity is that what we've got to include in it is we've got to capture a few other things within it. And one of the big ones is actually we've got to capture the risks of activities failing or the uncertainties about activities failing. We actually don't know enough about our project activities and whether the measures will actually achieve anything. What's the risk of you doing something and it failing or actually causing a bigger problem? A good example is if you could put in some current deflectors and they could start to erode the riverbank where you don't want it, and a farmer could lose his field. And I've actually seen it happen where fields have been eroded away. The farmer's not very happy. The material deposits on another farmer who is happy. Or I've seen the footings of a bridge being eroded away and the bridge collapse. So you've got to make sure that there's no risks, or you reduce the risks of your activity before any failure takes place. You've also got to build this into considering the effectiveness of different river types, river styles. And Angela Cannell will talk a little later about this, where you've got different rivers that behave differently, they act differently, they function differently, and therefore you have to choose your measures in relation to the different river types that we've actually got. Don't think one type of measure fits all, because it doesn't. It has to be relating to different river styles. I've already mentioned this, that you need to recognise that biological responses have long time scales. They take a long time, particularly in relation to fish. The fish population will take a huge length of time to go through. We need tools to account for ecological and social coupling. We cannot simply just go ahead and say that there is no, you just do it for ecological purposes. You've got to have social dimensions. Do people actually want it? Is it relevant? Is it going to compromise their activities? Will, if you restore a river, create more flooding, or will reduce flooding? So we've got many things to involve in there. And we need to explore this synergies between the sectors, which I've mentioned already, and I'll come back to in a minute. So the reality is that we've got to manage this over bigger timescales and manage people's expectations. Don't expect to get a complete outcome quickly, and don't expect to have a grand outcome, because quite often that's not achievable. So the way forward, how can we go forward? We've actually got to start to put in some project planning tools. We've got to have a complete understanding of our river, its ecosystem, its functioning, and we don't necessarily have that. We need some type of benchmarking, so we need to know what the status, the reference conditions are that we want to try and target, and therefore define key objectives against those targets. The benchmarking and the setting the objectives should be feasible, practical, measurable, so this is the SMART outcomes. And the questions that we need to ask is, what do we do, why are we doing it, and do we really need it? Should be asking these before we go ahead and project plan. And I've already mentioned that you need the social and economic framework. So you've got to put in the cost-benefit analysis and the social benefits. People really do need it, or do they need what's going on? Benchmarking, just to go in it briefly, benchmarking can be done by a number of ways. We can actually look at reference sites, we can look at natural conditions, and then compare those conditions against your site and see how we can move from the natural, from your degraded site towards what a reference condition is. The problem here is, how many of these have we got left, certainly in Europe? Not many. We can do predictive modelling, predict what the outcome should be and what we should be targeting, and there are plenty of tools available for that. We can have a look at historical information. We can actually go back and look at what in history and have a look at what your rivers used to look like. There are lots of old literature you can actually deal with it. So you can benchmark in different ways to set your targets. One of the best tools, or one of the best examples of this benchmarking is actually from North America, the Kissimmee River project. I'm going to mention this because it's quite important and it shows you what you can do. But you've got to bear in mind, this is a huge multi-million-dollar project, and so you've got to be realistic about what can be achieved. But this is an area in Florida where they actually reconnected a river, a beautiful river, and reconnected and restored it. And they went through the planning process in a very, very detailed way. And so there's a lot that can be learned from this tool. And what they did is they looked at the expectations in relation to hydrological, plant communities, invertebrate and amphibian communities, and also fish. And what did they want to try and achieve? And they set targets in relation to things like fish density, fish community structure, and the size composition of the fish. So they actually set quite realistic targets. And these are the sorts of endpoints or targets that we should be setting for all our restoration projects. They don't have to be complex, but they have to be something that's quantifiable. We can actually work on density of fish. It's quite relatively straightforward in smaller rivers, certainly, not necessarily in bigger rivers. And for each of those criteria, what we've got is an expectation of the against each of these activities or these outputs. What do you want? What is your target? The success of that target. What are you trying to define as that target? And then you've got the relative endpoints, so you're identifying certain characteristics or criteria that you want to measure against. A whole series of these activities exist, and I recommend that you go and have a look at the reference conditions, the documentation for the Kissimmee River. Which is this reference down here, Anderson. It's already available on the websites. The key thing about this is this whole process captures the risks I mentioned before, it captures uncertainties, it captures this social ecological coupling that I was mentioning here in terms of the constraints on the activities, and you've got time courses and milestones against which to do it. So you're putting in this time constraints. To move on, you've also, if you want to improve restoration success, it's necessarily to actually look at what else can constrain it or what else can support those sorts of activities. One of the key areas is looking at synergies between different user groups. And the sort of user groups we have in many of the European projects here are things like agriculture, urbanization. They influence what's going on. Hydropower, it influences what's going on. Water regulation, flow regulation, abstraction. They influence how you can implement your restoration activity. So we need to look at all these different processes in relation to the restoration activity and how it could either benefit or constrain what your activity is going to be. It's absolutely fundamental that we don't deal with your restoration measure in isolation. You must look at all the other activities that are taking place. And here's some of the synergies that you've actually got, and they already exist in many parts of the world. And here you've got things like flood protection, making the room for the rivers, which is the sort of thing that happens in the Netherlands, where they actually open up the river channel, so they've actually got room both for restoration and for flood protection. Navigation. Navigation activities occur on many of the large rivers, but can we use them in relation to improving restoration success? Agricultural practices, quite a lot of the problems come from agriculture, so if we can address the agricultural practice, we can probably improve the restoration measure. Hydropower is one of the big ones, one of the big issues that takes place, as is urban development. What can you do in urban areas? It's very different to what you can actually do in other places. By working with these other activities and these other stakeholders, we can actually expand the opportunities for restoration. And actually quite a lot of these can potentially fund the restoration measure, which is useful. So what it allows is wider societal acceptance of restoration activities. Another thing to build into it is an activity called the DIPSIA approach. I've mentioned this already. And the thing about DIPSIA, this driver's state impact response activities, is that it allows you to integrate the different activities into one. So your restoration is integrated within it. And what you've actually got here is a whole series of stakeholders. So this could be hydropower, this could be flood protection, this one here could be agriculture. And you're looking at what the drivers of each of those components are. So what is the driver of agriculture? Food production, requirements for water for abstraction. So what's driving it, and what will be the impact of those activities on your restoration activity? Will taking water for abstraction mean that there's not enough water left in the river for restoration? There's a whole series of interactions that you need to look at. And you can't just deal with just one stakeholder. There are many on each activity, so you've got to pull them all together. I'll briefly skip over but this is the structure of the DIPSIA approach, and I'll quickly skip over that at the moment. Here's an example of the DIPSIA, where you've actually got, in relation to flood protection, the driver is flood protection. We want to stop flooding, a very important societal activity. This relates to the activities you take place. You channelize the river, and then you will simplify that river channel. We've all seen it. You've got these narrow trapezoidal channels which have no habitat diversity. They're no good for biota in general terms. You take out all the vegetation. The impact of that will be loss on habitat for fish, loss on habitat for invertebrates. And so your response is to actually start to think about reconnecting the floodplain and putting meanders back in rivers, or you're putting physical structures that then will influence what's going on. So you do these types of approaches for each of the activities. And here's one broken down for hydropower, where you're actually looking at the pressure. Well, the driver is hydropower, the pressures that we get, hydropeaking, because we want power at different times of the year, times of the day. We have change in hydrological regime. We have the impoundment caused by the hydropower scheme. Often you get channelization. At the construction phase, you have problems which are removal of activities. So you've got the activities that are taking place, and you've got the turbine effect. So this could cause mortality in fish. Then you look at the states, you look at the impacts that these things will have on the river, and you look at the various responses you can have to it. So you can draw up tables of each of the different activities against the pressures that are generated by the activity. The key here is that actually these activities operate differently in different parts of the catchment. So you need to build up these dipsia approaches, nested dipsia approaches, for different positions in the catchment. They don't fit the whole catchment. So you've got to look at different phases, different stages in different parts of the catchment and build the whole picture and build it into a catchment scale approach. One other activity that comes out of that is you can build what are called concept maps. There's actually a very useful tool called a bow tie tool, and these are basically looking at cause effect. I know you can't actually see this very much, but what this is actually doing is looking and visualizing what the cause of the activity is and what the effect will be. So what's the impact of a particular activity? That allows you then to identify the key areas that you've got to improve on. And finally, a couple of other tools that perhaps we ought to be looking at is this cross-sectoral integration, is actually to look at multi-criteria decision trees. What's the relationships between these different activities? We've done it through dipsia, but that's quite complex, and sometimes when you look at the outcomes, such as that concept map I've shown you, it's very complex. So can we simplify it? And we can do this through a whole series of criteria, such as these interaction matrices, which come from environmental impact assessment tools. And what you're doing is looking at the different sectors, what the potential impacts of those sectors will be, and these relate to the different activities that potentially could achieve some desirable outcome. The black dots basically relate to where you can actually put this particular measure against this particular impact. So you can actually see what are the most appropriate measures against a particular impact. You can move this forward and actually quantify it. And we can do this by actually scoring it on a very simple way. And here is actually looking at urban development in terms of channelization and navigation in terms of channelization. And what can you actually do here? In terms of in the urban area, to improve channelization and you want to reconnect the floodplain, for example, it's not possible unless you want to flood your city, which may be a desirable outcome in some cases. But the pressure is big, but the potential of actually doing some reconnection of floodplains is negligible. And here you've got two scores. This is the pressure score, the scale of the problem, and this is the feasibility of the measure acting. And these are on a scale of 1 to 10. So big pressure, feasibility of operating it, negligible. In this case, in a navigation area, you've got a big pressure and you've got some potential for actually reconnecting the system. Built into this, we need a cost-effective measures, and I haven't got much time to go into this, but we've actually got to look at what is economically viable. We need to do economic analysis. We need to look at the socio-economic costs of some of these activities. So how much is going to cost? What's the benefits derived from the particular restoration activity you're putting in? How much is that restoration activity costing? What's the derived benefits from that? And the reality is this is very, very difficult to do because the costs of many activities are not measured. When you go through the literature looking for the costs and measures of the benefits in terms of economic terms, they don't exist. And if you look on the Reform website, there's several reports which actually look at this, and it's one of the big problems we've actually got. So how can you choose between which measure you want? You've got, say, 100,000 euros for activities. Which measure do you choose? What's going to give you the biggest benefits? And unfortunately, we don't necessarily have that information, and a lot of it's based on expert judgment. Just to finish off, to simplify that very complex project cycle, we can actually reduce it down to basically a six-step project cycle. Here's the project identification, the project formulation, looking at the financial aspects, the cost-benefit analysis, and build it into the project implementation phase, monitor it, and then evaluate it. So here we've actually got the project cycle broken into a simpler context. We've also got continually in here, and I should have mentioned it before, you've got a feedback loop. You've always got feedback. You've got to get stakeholder engagement. There's no point in going to engage with a project and not get stakeholder involvement and engagement. And that's clearly seen that if you want a successful project, you've got to have all the stakeholders involved. Built into that, project management tool, we've got all the tools I've mentioned earlier here. So if you're going to have a look at the project identification, you can use the river management plans and formulation of them, the DIPSI approach, and looking at various directives to set your objectives. You've got, for project formulation, you've got the SMART tool, SMART objectives, setting benchmarks and endpoints. And so you've got a whole series of tools that fit into each component that you can actually bring in. With the financing, you need to do cost-benefit analysis. Identify the key projects. Don't take away the economic side of it. It is mostly lacking because most of us are actually either biologists or planners or hydromorphological people. We're not economists. You need to engage with these people to get these cost-benefit analysis done. The project implementation, you can use things like the Pragma approach that's been developed for actually implementation for checking what's going on. And then the monitoring linking to environmental impact tools such as BACI, before after control impact assessment tools. And then finally, post-evaluation. Build it in to the bigger picture. And finally, just to put that in, these are for individual projects. Let's build this into the whole catchment scale project. And so you need to build these into a catchment scale approach where you've actually got the river characterization, which I've mentioned earlier. Look at your condition state of your river, the status, and look at what's potentially possible. And then run it through these project cycles for each of the measures that may be potentially available to you. Finally, to identify those measures, one tool that is readily available for you is this particular tool on the wiki, on the Reform wiki. If you want to find the measures, you can actually go to the wiki, the Reform wiki, go on board, and you can actually identify the pressure that you're trying to deal with, and then go through the whole wiki process and identify what other people have done, whether it's been successful or not. Find out what activities are available to you. A very useful tool which I recommend you will to look at, and in one of the other lectures this will be developed in more detail. And this is the overall framework that we come out with the typologies, the measures, pressures. So it's all built into a project framework. So I'll finish there. Thank you very much.